All right, guys, so we have an awesome interview and discussion for you guys today. I'm talking to Michael Brooks. He's a contributor to the Majority Report with Sam Seder, of course. And do I have this right, Michael? You also have worked with, or you do work with, both Al Jazeera and the Washington Post?
I've published articles in both of those places. I also worked with the American-Iranian Council. And, I do some brand strategy work and stuff like that, too.
All right, awesome. Sweet, man. So let's talk a little bit about my attempt to try to bridge a gap between new atheists and progressives. I kind of admitted when I did the segment, I think I'm going to fail, and then I did fail. So I'm not too disappointed because, the camps were already so in opposite corners that I thought it was a very low percentage chance that I would actually succeed. But I think at least my audience got something out of it, if nothing else. But so Sam did a segment, Sam Seder, of course, not necessarily countering my thing, but just disagreeing in certain parts here. And since you're a contributor for him, I'm curious. So what are your thoughts on this whole thing? Where do you think I'm right? Where do you think I'm wrong? And all that.
Well, I should. I've been talking about this stuff on the show for a while. And this sort of, I guess Sam Harris specifically as a character kind of pops up, and this whole debate is pretty heated on both sides. I think I tend to agree with Sam, although I think I might have a slightly different perspective than he does. But I guess my main problem, and where I did agree, because Sam's segment basically focused really specifically on one part of your truce video, which was, it was a good piece. And if there's going to be a truce, it will come through something like what you did. But I think the issue is that what Sam articulated and what my issue is, it was specifically with regards to calling these guys neoconservatives. And I guess, you sort of had this perspective, as I understood it, that that's really fundamentally unfair because you're talking about people who, across a whole slew of other issues, whether it's marriage equality or the environment or, presumably, I'm assuming probably Sam Harris has like a good position on health care, that these guys are not neocons. Now, that may be true. Neocon has a kind of complicated intellectual history. It actually did initially sort of arise around a backlash around domestic policy and a kind of social reaction to the 60s. But in the modern, sense, modern usage, it's about foreign policy. And it's a view on Islam specifically, and it's a highly sort of militaristic view of the world. Now, you get to a guy like Sam Harris, I think, and what I find frustrating is I feel like his followers will always say you're being unfair to him, sort of, even if you're essentially quoting him. But I look at a guy and I say, okay, I'm not clear what his position on Iraq is, but I'll table that. But on the invasion of Iraq. But if you go through Afghanistan, you go through surveillance issues, you go through, and even explaining why Iraq was a failure. His explanation of why Iraq was a failure is basically because Shias and Sunnis are barbarians. And I think, I think that worldview of some type of civilizational clash that usually sort of ends up essentially justifying U.S. and Israeli policies, it's a pretty neocon worldview. And I'm going along here, but just to add really quickly, the other aspect of this I have a problem with is not just like there's the kind of softy, liberal, don't be mean to people thing, but I also speak from the perspective that I do think some of these groups, whether it's Daesh or Al-Qaeda, there are real security challenges here. And precisely because there are some real challenges here, you need to get really precise and smart in your thinking about these regional dynamics. And I don't just mean like, everything's the U.S.'s fault, because it's not. But a lot of it is internal politics, internal geography, internal conflicts that are really complicated, have something to do with religion. A lot of it doesn't have much to do with religion. And kind of sitting back with this sort of easy view of Islam, I think it's bad civics in an American context and how it relates to the American community, and it often aids foolish foreign policy. So that's kind of my basic manifesto.
So there are many areas where I disagree with Sam Harris, and I've laid them out before. I did a segment, for example, where, the Chomsky email where he went back and forth. And in my segment on that, I almost totally agreed with Chomsky, and I disagreed with Sam Harris. In the podcast with Dan Carlin, as you guys have pointed out, I think he's too open to the idea of interventionism, and I'm a fairly committed non-interventionist. So, there are areas where I disagree with him, and I'm not hesitant to point them out. But my concern is that I dislike it when people who are generally correct and on the proper side of different issues, when there's this glossing over of nuance in the positions of the people that we're debating against. And what I mean by that is, so you rightly pointed out, okay, he's better on all these other issues, but on foreign policy he has some concerning stuff. I agree with that, but hand in hand with that, I always feel like it's incumbent upon everybody, for accuracy's sake, to just throw out the caveats and the hedges. For example, when I discuss libertarians on my show, I'll go after them ruthlessly, but I always try to throw in at some point in the midst of a rant against libertarian economic policy, hey, I'm kind of with these guys when it comes to legalizing drugs. I'm with these guys when it comes to being non-interventionist, foreign policy-wise. I'm with these guys on 40 to 50% of the issues. So I always feel like in order for us to be better and for us to be accurate, we have to point out that when we argue against a person like Sam Harris, it's simply not the same as arguing against a blithering idiot like Rush Limbaugh. You know what I mean? And that's my main concern, is that I feel like Sam Harris and his followers certainly have a point when they say, hey, we're mad at progressives because they're characterizing Sam as if he's some sort of a buffoon, when that's demonstrably not true.
Yeah, but I guess my issue is, it's twofold, and I'll throw Bill Maher in here for a minute to in some ways illustrate my point. So I think actually some of the things that Bill Maher says about Israel, the Palestinians, and Muslims writ large, on just sort of a very objective kind of wow, yeah, that's a legitimately bigoted statement, not in some oversensitive, unable to take criticism's way. I think Bill Maher says things sometimes that are just sort of, even as an example, he'll always do these rants, well, why aren't Muslims fighting ISIS? Well, Muslims are fighting ISIS. They're called Kurds, and they're the prime opponents of them on the ground. So it's
and Iran, by the way.
Yeah, and in Iran profoundly, right. That's the whole, exactly. So good you brought that up. That's a whole other thing that probably Bill Maher doesn't want to talk about. But I will say, look, combined with that, he's also pretty staunchly, he's probably less interventionist than I might be, frankly. So I acknowledge that. But the thing with Sam Harris is it's okay, so he may be right on these other issues, but his prime function as a public intellectual is, with regards to politics, I don't really have a strong feeling one way or another about his version of atheism. And I'm certainly personally very secularist. I probably don't think that atheism is a panacea that he might think it is, but that being said, that's not what I object to. But his prime writing on politics and international relations is this stuff. So he didn't write, a policy manifesto where I was like, wow, that's, basically his mission is, something really positive. Say even something that involved foreign policy. He's really just committed to, women's rights in Saudi Arabia, and he wants us to recalibrate policy there to reflect that. Or he's really serious about counterterrorism, so he wants us to, look at counterfunding madrasas in Pakistan, right? If he did something, I was like, okay, that's cool, I get that. And then maybe if he had a little graph where I was like, whoa, that's a pretty questionable read of Iraq, dude, I would have a different feeling about it. But primarily it seems like he intervenes in policy debates to mostly either justify something like Cast Lead, have a view of the Iraq War, which, as I say, even if I buy his explanation that he never supported the invasion, is to basically just say, all of the fallout of this is purely down to Muslims being savage and barbaric and hating each other. And which, again, it's not just oh, I'm politically correct, I don't like that you say that. It's that's wrong. And that type of attitude is actually connected to why, the Sunni awakening collapsed, or why, Maliki was not sort of reined in by U.S. or U.S. partners, right? So there's a practical upshot to it. So I guess for me, it's like Sam Harris's prime role in politics and policy is destructive. So even so I don't, and with his followers, it's like, I don't know what to tell you. I'm not questioning, and I get this blowback. I'm not questioning the guys. I don't think he's a moron, but I don't know that every single right-wing pundit out there is a total moron. I'm not kind of questioning his personal intellectual acuity. I'm just saying his writing about policy and his writing about a pretty large group of people is wrong, and there's some real implications for that go way beyond like hurt feelings and being politically correct. They actually, in my view, undermine security, undermine strategy, and other important things.
So you can definitely question his tactics, and at times I've questioned his tactics, and like I said, he's more open to the idea of intervention than I am, even though it is true that he opposed the Iraq War. But I take issue with
Is that 100% true? I'm not to debate, but is that like just unequivocally true?
Well, here I'll let you can determine for yourself, because I'll just play this for you real fast.
So you seem to think I'm much more hawkish than I am. I think you and I probably on the checklist of interventions, you and I might check the same boxes. If you're going to check Afghanistan and you're going to check targeted covert operations against the really, really bad guys that we can get without too much collateral damage, then we're checking the same boxes, right? I didn't check the Iraq war box.
By the way, people often charge you with that, but I did my research. You did not do that.
It's not true.
So, but putting that aside, and by
that.
the way, I would tend to agree with you that I was against the war in Afghanistan as well. Targeted in Afghanistan would have been fine to me, but an all-out war I don't think makes sense either. But understand, like, the thing that also gets me is that one of the things he's doing today, or he's trying to do, is he's working with a guy named Majid Nawaz, who's basically a liberal secular Muslim, and they wrote a book together. They did a book together where the whole idea is basically trying to push a narrative, a reformist narrative, where there's like liberal ways to interpret Islam to make it so that other Muslims, if they're religious, they can be devoutly religious but have a liberal secular interpretation of the world. And I dislike it when I think progressives or liberals gloss over that aspect of his work, because as he said even in the interview with Cenk here, there are times where he goes on to say, my main focus is a war of ideas. And on that front, on the front of war of ideas, I think he's basically 100% right, in the sense that he's trying to say, look, religion almost by definition is dogmatism. It's taking, a doctrine and saying, I'm just going to subscribe to this. And half of the doctrines are usually good and half of them are bad. But since the half bad is in there, it's something that we have to be wary of, and we have to make sure that our fellow humans don't, buy into it too much and act based off of it. So fighting on that front in the war of ideas, would you say that it's fair to not question his motives and say, you know what, he actually may be right to fight on that front?
Well, actually, I want to just sort of say parenthetically, I'm not really into questioning motives per se. I don't, I have been very, very sharply critical of Sam Harris, but, I personally sort of, know people that know him through social circles, and I don't think that Sam Harris wakes up in the morning thinking, how can he make the world a worse place? So, we're talking at that very basic level. I'm not questioning motives, but I have another problem with even this so-called sort of moderate Muslim work for a couple of reasons. And I have to just circle back to Iraq just for a moment because I think it's connected to this. I saw the interview too, but I've also read his original writing where, again, his position was very ambiguous and he seemed much more invested in, explaining why Noam Chomsky was wrong for opposing it than actually engaging with, what was actually happening, which was just sort of, blunderous, strategic, non sequitur. And, so I do think there are problems in that position. But being that as it may, setting that aside, okay, so Sam Harris claims and does some work with some very, very secularized Muslim writers and people in a Western context. And I think, again, on a personal level, I probably tend to agree with these people. But, you know, I spent time in the region in the Middle East. I've spent time and studied, you know, people like Fatima Mernissi, who's a very important Moroccan feminist writer and analyst. And these people are actually in these environments and in the trenches trying to reconcile these contradictions and make things work. And I have never heard from anybody in these actual situations that when Sam Harris comes out and, you know, primarily justifies drone policies or, you know, talks about, you know, some thought experiment to justify some policy or another, and then sort of adds the caveat that, oh, but this is really about the war of ideas, and I support some Muslim guy who, again, might be a great person, but doesn't have any local credibility or local following. I've never heard that that's helpful. And then the other problem is that, you know, okay, I agree with that. Let's support insofar as we can play any internal role in somebody else's religion, which is sort of like another question. You know, I don't know how much influence I have inside the internal debate of a group I'm not a part of, but I certainly support liberalism. I certainly support human rights. So, of course, I'm on the side of liberal Muslims. Great. But I don't say that the fundamental, true, and accurate expression of Islam is al-Qaeda, which is what Sam Harris says. So it's a total performative contradiction. So if he wants to say, I'm on the side of the moderate liberal Muslims, awesome, me too, let's back them up. And then he turns around and, well, wait a second. Is it the motherload of bad ideas and the people who are the real Muslims are in Daesh or al-Qaeda or whatever, or is this a malleable cultural phenomenon like anything else, and we're going to try to push our side of it? Totally with that argument. But Sam Harris is contradicting himself there, too, and that undermines his ability to be a messenger in the war of ideas.
So would you say that you're not, in principle, opposed to religious doctrine?
See, that is like a totally relevant question. I mean, if you're talking about a place where, so for me personally, am I religious? No. But I don't think that even if we're staying in this zone of the world, you know, if you look at read a book like by Robert Malik, I think it's called The Cry from Algeria. I'm sorry that I'm messing that title up. It's really an awesome book. And, you know, he talks about basically the failures of secular nationalist movements across the Middle East, which really was like the prime politics of kind of post-colonial Arab politics, was these highly secularized nationalist movements. And then the rise of fundamentalist Islam and kind of in place of those failures. And I want to be really clear that, like, I don't, you know, these groups and these doctrines, again, another simple distinction, I don't think Islam is a problem, but certainly Wahhabism is a problem, certainly Salafism is a problem. And those things arose in place of those failures. So I guess I think of religion as being pretty contingent and pretty contextual, and I'm more interested in, you know, how people express their religion than they're religious per se. You know, I mean, I have more admiration for a guy like Desmond Tutu than I do a guy like Charles Koch, and I think Charles Koch is a self-avowed atheist, and Desmond Tutu is a Christian, right? I
think that you're partly right to point out that in many circumstances where radicalization occurs, it's almost solely because of a geopolitical situation or an economic situation. I personally would point to Iran, which proves that case, and the Palestinian territories, which proves that case. I mean, it's rather clear that the occupation has led to, you know, more Palestinian fundamentalism in the sense that they turn more to Hamas or a group like that. And in the case of Iran, you could say it's the U.S. coup that led them to become radicalized, because one of the places they could get away from the Shah, the dictator, was the mosques, and they can, you know, plan from there.
That's right.
So I grant you that point, but hand in hand with that also comes the other half of it, which I also think is true, which is that it's possible, and in many real-world situations it's the case, that the root of the problem is not political situations. The root of the problem is the actual doctrine itself. And a good example of that would be, like, for example, what just happened in Israel with an ultra-Orthodox Jew who stabbed somebody in an LGBT pride parade. That
Sure,
has absolutely nothing to do with economics, absolutely nothing to do with poverty or a geopolitical situation. He's just a brainwashed idiot who carried out his fundamentalist beliefs. And it's not just limited to Jewish fundamentalism. It's not just limited to Christian fundamentalism that can be doctrinal. It could be in Islam as well.
Clear. I've never said that. I mean, and I think I don't have any problem with registering the dangers of any type of fanaticism, Islamic, Jewish, Hindu, whatever. And I don't even have a problem per se of saying, like, look, I think it's pretty obvious I don't have the same type of polarized view on it that maybe, that we might view this differently on a certain fundamental level. But I think there's no question that sort of like the big three Abrahamic religions, there's a lot of material in there that can be used in very, very damaging ways. I don't, that to me is not a controversial point. But again, I guess we can stay on that track, and it's a worthwhile conversation. And I'm still, my thought process is fluid on that, to be honest with you. But again, going back to this project, then, when people say, "Oh, guys like Sam Harris, what they're trying to do is actually empower moderate Muslims in that battle of ideas." Okay, but again, if you then sort of, because we went through that process of like, all right, so it's a little bit contradictory that you're saying you want to support moderate Muslims, but then you're saying that the only real Muslims are total fanatics and Wahhabis and crazy people, okay? So that's contradictory. And so then I feel like in these conversations, instead of addressing that contradiction, then it shifts into, but like, isn't religion really just on some level the problem, and isn't really secularism just preferable? And that may or may not be the case. Actually, in fact, I would say secularism is preferable. I would certainly concede that and happy to support that and do support that. But that then leaves you, in my view, at like a total impasse, which is like, okay, so that's your belief. If you really think that writing in a sort of disrespectful, simplistic way, and you can be secularist and anti-religion and have a much more sophisticated understanding of religion than unfortunately, people like Sam Harris to me all too often display. But, what's the upshot of that? Okay, great. Your religions are stupid and you're mouth breathers. Cool.
Well,
and,
look,
you can feel self-righteous in Reddit forums about it, but I don't think that's going to do much.
But I think, take my show, for example. I've attempted to make it my mission to not only do the news, but also get certain concepts and ideas and policies out there more. Some of the things I support and I push for are, social liberalism. I want personal freedom for people to put whatever they want in their bodies and do whatever they want with their bodies. I prefer a non-interventionist foreign policy where the West stops creating enemies and we only fight for matters of self-defense. But also one of the things that I fight for is the idea that any kind of dogmatic ideology from any religion is inherently dangerous, because once you let go of reason and you admit, I don't care about the truth necessarily, well then that can end up in many bad places. So even if different religious doctrines might be half good, half bad, there's still an issue there of somebody saying this is going to be my philosophy of life is going to be based off this ancient book. And I think it's a rather noble thing to try to explain to the world, like, okay, you may have a good view of this book or a bad view of this book, and you may cherry pick it, yada, yada. But the core problem is still there, which is you've sacrificed reason and your own logic to join a club of which half of the coding in the writing is terribly dogmatic and in some cases dangerous. So I agree with you that, like, Sam should – sorry, let me just finish this point real quick. Sam should come out more in favor of non-interventionism and talk about – but one of my issues with him is that he doesn't focus enough on state violence, and he doesn't talk enough about how violence to try to get natural resources and more geopolitical power, that can be just as bad as religious violence, and in some cases it's more prevalent. So my issue with Sam is that he doesn't focus as much on that as he should. But in terms of talking about the problems with religious doctrine, Christian and Muslim, because he wrote Letter to a Christian Nation, which destroys Christianity, my problem is not that he's pointing out fallacies within religion and contradictions within religion and the fact that certain beliefs have certain consequences insofar as they're really believed.
Yeah, so then I guess, okay, so they'll move to a little bit of a different terrain then. It's a bigger question. It's a really important question. But again, I guess I would just say then that to me, then people should stop tweeting at me about how, like, Sam Harris is really into supporting moderate Muslims and, partnering with Muslims. It's like, okay, dude, you're not into religion. Fine. Okay. You think the real Muslims are the fanatics, and that's what you believe. I fundamentally disagree with that.
I would just say,
but stop playing this shell game, because those are totally incompatible positions.
I'm in the camp of I think we should argue against religion as a matter of principle, but at the same time, I would much more prefer, obviously, somebody like Majid Nawaz or somebody like Reza Aslan to be the more, prominent voices in Islam, just like I would prefer Martin Luther King to be the more prominent voice within Christianity. You know what I mean? By the way, we have 40 seconds, so quick, make your last point, and then we're going to cut off here.
No, absolutely. No, I think the last point that I would have where I think there is a bigger fundamental difference. I just sort of go back into some history of these ideas, and I look at the positivist movement in the 18th and 19th century, and I think as repulsive as fundamentalism is, and really as shocking as it is that people hold on to fanatical beliefs and the problems that poses, I think that the kind of trust and faith in a sort of narrow type of rationalism as solving our problems or invariably kind of leading us to a better path is, unfortunately, that's not our savior.
We got 10
either.
seconds, and then we're going to be cut off.
Yeah, and unfortunately we look at it, we see people like Sam Harris, even with that light, still supporting bad policies. But I really appreciate the time, man. It was great talking to you.